Some non-golfers can be forgiven for thinking that a scratch handicapper is equal to a tour professional, but the truth is there is miles between the two. So thanks to numbers from Arccos Golf gleaned from some 800 million real shots, we've been able to take these stats from scratch golfers, 0.0 index golfers, and compare them against PGA Tour stats to see how big that golf is. And spoiler warning, it's pretty big. So let's start with driving. Let's do distance first between this scratch golfer and tour professional. We're going to do average tour stats to start. So a scratch golfer averages 259 yards off the tee, which would leave them an awful long way back of the average player on the PGA Tour. And that average is 299.9 yards. So let's just call it 300, shall we? Meaning scratch players are going to be on average just over 40 yards back from their PGA Tour counterparts. Now, if we then look at that comparison between the longest player on tour, which in 22-23 was Rory McIlroy, he averaged 326 yards. So that scratch player would now be about 66 yards behind McIlroy on average, which is such a huge difference when you think about the irons they'll be hitting into the green, how far back they are on par 4s and par 5s, and which par 4s and par 5s become reachable. Now let's look at driving accuracy, and unsurprisingly once again the Tour pros are much more accurate. The scratch golfer will find a fairway 51% of the time, which is pretty good, but the average PGA Tour professional is hitting just under 60, so nearly 10% more there. During the 2023 season, it was Russell Henley who was the most accurate, and he hit a whopping 72% of fairways across a season, which is pretty huge. So ultimately, that driving distance is a huge golf, while the accuracy of about 10% is pretty significant too. Right then, next up, let's check greens in regulation, approach play. So not only are these players now PGA Tour pros about 40 yards further up the hole than their scratch counterpart, but they're hitting more greens too, probably because they're a bit closer on average, depends on the courses they're playing. But let's look at the stats. A scratch golfer hits an average of 56% of greens in regulation, while the PGA Tour average is 66.32. So 10% difference there, again, similar to driving accuracy we just looked at. For some context about who's doing that on the tour at the minute, world number one at the time of recording, Scottie Scheffler led the tour in greens in regulation last year, and for the past 2 years in fact. So 2 years ago it was 72.29%, and in 2023, 74.43% of greens hit. I'm a single index golfer, and to me scratch golfers are like, wow, I'm nowhere near them and they're nowhere near these PGA Tour players at the end of the day. So for Scottie Scheffler, that equates to 13.4 greens in regulation per round, whereas scratch golfers are averaging just over 10. So we're on the green now and we're putting, but what is the difference between scratch and tour pros here? Now we're going to look at number of 1 putts, number of 3 putts, and then total putts per round on average between these two players. So let's start with 3 putts. A scratch golfer averages 1.3 3 putts per round, which is still pretty low, whereas the PGA Tour average at the minute stands at 0.49, which is less than a 3 putt every other round. Now the best for this last year on the PGA Tour was Aaron Baddeley. Do you remember him? Not seen him for a while. However, he averaged just 0.24 3 putts per round last season on the tour, which is 1 every what? Less than 1 every 4, which is pretty crazy to think. Such a huge gulf between these two players at the minute. Let's look at 1 putts per round then. So 0-digit golfers are 1 putting 5.2 times per round on average, which still falls well short of the PGA Tour average, which was 7.07 in 2023. Topping the rankings for that on the tour was Taylor Montgomery, who averaged 8.29 1 putts per round. And Montgomery also topped the putts per round statistics with an average of 27.38. Now that stat is almost 1.7 lower than the tour average, which is 29.02 putts per round, with scratch golfers averaging 30.7 putts per round. So about 1.7 more putts than the average tour pro from last year. And they add up really, don't they? The amount of 3 putts, the amount of 1 putts, and those total putts per round show you those sort of differences between scratch players and those Tour pros. So lastly then, when we're comparing these two golfers, and I want to just pause for a minute and think about what the actual handicap differences are between a scratch golfer and a Tour pro. So the average handicap of the current PGA Tour players is predicted at around plus 5.4. So we're talking 5.5 shot difference between your scratch player here. Tiger Woods in 2008, his handicap was estimated to be plus 11 or plus 12. I know John Rahm's on the World Handicap System was predicted to be around this 18 months ago. So we've seen the golf in areas of the game in the stats, and we can see that ultimately leads to about 5 shots per round. That's the key difference there. But let's finally look at scoring totals, right? What happens in birdies and bogeys and how each type of player plays on par 3s, 4s and 5s, right? So start with scoring. Tour pros, shock horror, pick up more birdies and bogey less than scratch golfers, but how many? So the Tour leader last year for birdies per round was Ludwig. Aubert, 4.76 per round, which is pretty whopping, and that's well over double the amount a scratch player will make, which is 2.2. The Tour average for birdies at the minute is 3.72, so that still gives you 1.5 more birdies per round for a PGA Tour pro than a scratch player. So for bogeys, the story's very, very similar. If we look at a scratch player, they're making 2 more bogeys per round than the PGA Tour pros and 2.8 more than the PGA Tour leader, which last year was Scotty Scheffler making just 1.82 bogeys per round, which is kind of mad to think really, isn't it? But I guess when they're driving it that accurately, hitting that many greens, it's going to happen, isn't it? If we look at the scoring on par 3s, 4s, and 5s, it's actually very similar here, which I found really interesting when we dived into this. So on par 3s, a scratch golfer average is 3.1, a PGA Tour average is 3.06, so that's pretty negligible. Par 4s, a bit more of a golf here, scratch golfers average 4.2, the pros average 4.03, so just a hair over par on those par 4s. Finally then, on the par 5s, this is where both scratch and pro golfers take advantage of golf courses and start scoring a bit better, but the pros do it marginally better again. So the par 5 average for a scratch golf is 4.7, whereas it's 4.63 for the PGA Tour Pro. So we can kind of see there where the scoring chips away, and it feels to me at least like the biggest difference, and we all knew there was one anyway, but the biggest difference is that driving distance, huge amount of driving distance. And I guess when these pros are playing much longer courses, much tighter courses, that does play to their advantage. But I think ultimately, although we knew the differences were big between these two players, the stats from Arccos have shown us they're perhaps even bigger than we initially thought.